My name is Kathy Wicks, and I'm the Director of Sustainability for UMass Dining and Auxiliary Enterprises on campus. And our sustainability team has put together these resilience and sustainable virtual gatherings. And today's topic that Dan Bensonoff, the garden manager, is going to lead is about seed starting. So we'll go through the kind of an overview of the topic. He'll do some demonstrations. We'll have an opportunity for question and answer, but please feel free to use the chat for questions as we go through this, and we'll jump in when they come up, but there will be some time at the end to ask some questions as well. And then if we have time at the end, we will do some garden updates. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Dan is in the garden right by Franklin, and Tyler Tedesco, the Regional Food Systems Coordinator, is there helping with the being able to make this a live stream. So Dan, go ahead.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everybody out there. Welcome to the third episode of our resiliency series. I'm excited to be out here today on a gorgeous spring day. We're lucky that it's not raining. It's going to be raining tomorrow, so we have beautiful weather, and I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite things to do in early spring, which is starting seeds. For me, this is really what gets me excited about the season ahead. So I want to share some tips with you today about how we start seed here, and give you guys a chance to ask any questions you have. We're also going to be starting some seed together, so you'll get to see that. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you about what's happening in the garden as well. So why don't we get started? So first of all, let's just kind of talk about why you would want to start seed. I'm assuming you're here because you want to learn, but for me, there's a few important reasons why. For one, it's the magic of growing something from a tiny little seed to a big plant in the single season oftentimes. That's really what gets me going. So I'm holding some tomatillo seeds here. We'll talk about these a bit later. And they're just tiny little seeds. I mean, you know, we're talking about the size of a sesame seed. Very, very small. And within 2 months, 3 months, these are going to be, you know, almost as tall as me, about shoulder height, which is just truly a miracle that something can grow that fast. So to me, it's really about being in that journey from the very beginning. Now, of course, you can also go out to a nursery and buy plants, and that's perfectly fine. And if that's the only option you have, absolutely go for it, right? But there's a lot, you know, I think that you miss part of that journey if you're buying plants that have already been started. Now, another really important consideration is the cost. These seeds cost about 5 to 10 cents a piece. If you're saving your own seed, those are free seeds. So that's a really big difference versus buying them at a nursery where you're often paying $1 or $2 for a single tomato plant, for example, or a tomatillo plant. Larger plants can often cost you $10, $15, $20. Now, of course, there's a time investment when you're starting your own seed, but ultimately that really pays off. You're going to save a lot of money. It's 10 to 100 times cheaper to be starting your own seed versus buying plants at a nursery. The last important consideration of why I like to start my own seed is that you have so much more flexibility about what you're going to grow. At a nursery, even the best nursery available, you're generally going to be extremely limited. Tomatoes, they may have a lot of varieties of, but if you're buying something like, let's say, beets or tomatillo or winter squash, you may be limited to 1, 2, or a handful of varieties. But if you're buying seed from a seed catalog, I have a Johnny's seed catalog here, you're going to have a choice of 100+ varieties oftentimes for any individual fruit or vegetable or flower or herb that you might want to grow. And that really opens up so many possibilities. You can really start to get into heirloom varieties that are extremely rare, and that might have beautiful flavor, color, texture, or resilience in our area here. And a lot of those are just not going to be available commercially. So for those reasons, I think it's really important that as growers, as people who are interested in supplying some of their own food, medicine, beautiful landscapes, wildlife habitat, that we really start to learn how to begin that process for ourselves by seed start. So let's talk about what you actually need to get started with seeds. So a few basic materials. Now, of course, you need a container of some kind, right? You need to put your seedlings somewhere. So let's talk about some options that we have for containers. Probably the most commonly used one is a plastic container, which come in a lot of different variations, right? You could just go with a pot that usually would house a single plant. That's perfectly fine. And you can see here, we're going to be working with these later. These are some lupins, which is a beautiful flowering perennial plant that also builds soil. So we just started these in this pot. You can also use what are called flats, which are just really rectangular boxes that you can put soil in and just sprinkle your seeds in there. Or you can use plastic celled containers, which have individual cells that usually would house one plant per cell. And I'll talk about why you'd want to go with maybe a cell versus an open flat container in a little bit. But plastic, of course, has its downside, right? It's going to be persistent in the environment for a very long time. And especially if you're using flimsy plastic like this, you can see it's already extremely damaged. And that's after just a few uses. So even though this is the industry standard, and it is very convenient, it really has its downsides. They're extremely disposable. So from a sustainability point of view, we should be looking at other alternatives. If you do want to use plastic, get yourself a rigid plastic container like this pot or an open cell. I think that those generally seem to last a lot longer. So that's really what I recommend if you want to go the plastic route. Other options, though, include something like these. These are compostable containers that are actually made out of dehydrated cow manure. Honestly, I have no idea how they can make a container like this out of cow manure, but supposedly it's possible. And the beautiful thing about these is that you can actually plant the entire thing. When it comes time to plant these, I can stick the entire plant with the pot right in the ground and bury it right at soil level, and this will eventually decompose right into the soil. Now, if you do want to use these, I do recommend before you transplant them to kind of tear it up a little bit, just so that the roots really have a bit of a head start in getting through that container. But otherwise, you can put the whole thing right in there and it'll disappear in the matter of a few months. Now, there are other options. This year, I discovered this handy dandy tool. Whoops. This is called a newspaper pot roller. And it's a really convenient tool. You can actually make one of these yourself. But what it allows you to do is to take paper, or ideally newspaper. I don't have any paper, but just using some regular old paper, and you can make your own pot. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that real quick. So you take one of these, and I just folded up a paper in half, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and roll it up right around there. And then I'm going to just kind of push that paper in on the bottom. And I'm going to use that bottom piece to just secure everything in place. And what I end up with is more or less a container for soil. And you can see once I fill it up, that's a perfectly good pot. You can stick your seed right in there. And again, this is compostable. So once you're ready, you can just plant the whole thing. You don't even have to take it out of the paper. The paper will go right in the soil and will decompose right in the soil. So this is a really nice thing. Costs about $10. If you look up newspaper pot maker, you should be able to find it online without too much trouble. You can probably get it at your local nursery as well. So those are a few options for containers. Now, we need soil as well. And unfortunately, regular old garden soil or compost is not ideal for starting seed. I really do recommend, if you can, to try to get a potting mix. Now here in our permaculture gardens, we use what's called, this is a Vermont Compost Company, and you can see it says compost-based potting mix on here. And it has all sorts of things in there. Doesn't really matter what company you use. I do generally recommend organic potting mix only because you don't necessarily want to be including a lot of synthetic fertilizers or whatever else they might be including in there, because ultimately that's going to end up in your food and that's going to end up in your body as well. So try to get an organic one if you can. The most important thing is that your potting mix is very light. The ideal potting mix should allow for roots to easily penetrate while also holding a lot of moisture. So this potting mix has a lot of perlite added in and a lot of peat moss added in to make it really, really light and porous and water retaining. If you don't have access to potting mix, or if you don't want to buy any, you can make your own. So there's a few different ways of doing that, but generally speaking, you want 1 part soil or compost, 1 part either peat moss or coconut coir, something that's going to be very light and water retaining, and 1 part sand or perlite, something that's going to allow for really good drainage as well. So one easy way of doing that, you could even just dig up some good quality garden soil right from your backyard and mix it with some sand and some peat moss or coconut coir, roughly equal parts, and that should get you a really nice potting mix. It's not going to be quite as good as something you get commercially. This is blended with not only some of the things we mentioned, but also with some additional chicken manure and other fertilizers that will help boost the plant's fertility as it grows. So
can you say what coconut flour
yeah,
is?
yeah. So coconut coir is the material. If you can imagine a mature coconut, that brown stuff around the coconut, the hairy kind of outside layer, that is a waste product from the coconut industries, right? So when you're coconut water or coconut meat pulp, all of those industries, they tend to produce a lot of coconuts, and that outside gets shredded and it becomes a really useful material for gardeners and for farmers, and that's what is called coconut coir. It usually comes in a brick form. It's very dry when you get it, and you have to rehydrate it by basically soaking it in water, and it'll puff up. And it's very light. It doesn't have any nutrients, but it holds water really, really well, and it's just a really good material for roots to penetrate easily, and just great material for starting seeds. So we use that pretty frequently as well, and it is more sustainable than peat moss. Peat moss is a mined material that comes from underground in peat bogs. It is somewhat renewable, but we're mining it at a level that is not quite sustainable. So in general, coconut coir is the way to go if you really want to be eco-sensitive. Now, whatever you get, make sure that before you start using it, that you give your potting mix a really nice dose of water. I'm gonna go ahead and give it some water right now. And what I'm looking for is a potting mix that is evenly moist, kind of sponge-like. So I want to be able to pick it up and maybe get a few drops, but I don't want it to be sopping wet. But I certainly don't want it to be dry either. So that's nice and evenly moist right now. It's ready to go. Now, what else do you need to start seed? You need some kind of a work area. So you can see I'm outside right now. I set up this table here. And wherever you happen to be, you need to be able to kind of get that area dirty because you are going to be working with soil. You also are going to be watering as well. So your living room, your kitchen might not be ideal unless you have a really good station there that you can work on or you're okay with some cleanup. I like to do it outside, or if you have a shed, you can put up a bench there. Wherever you want to be, just make sure you're set to go with all the materials you need. Now, really importantly, after you start your seeds, they do need to go somewhere where they're going to have access to full light and adequate temperatures for germination. Different plants have different germination temperature ranges. For example, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillos, those are all in the same nightshade family. Those are tropical plants, and they want really hot temperatures in order to germinate. We're talking 75 degrees at a minimum and up to 95 degrees. So if you don't have an area with that kind of temperature, I would recommend investing in what's called a heat mat, which is basically an electric mat that goes underneath wherever you're going to be starting seeds. So it might go right underneath this tray here, and it just provides some bottom heat. It's really, really useful, and you're going to get much better results, especially for those heat-loving plants. Now, there are some plants that you don't really need really hot temperatures in order to germinate. For example, if you're going to be germinating arugula seed inside, or broccoli or cauliflower, those can be quite cool, 60 degrees, even 50 degrees, they'll germinate okay. So for those, you might even just want to invest in a protected space outside, like a cold frame, and that will be perfectly fine. They'll germinate a little bit slower than they would at, let's say, 75 or 80 degrees, but they will germinate given a little bit extra time. They just need a little bit coddling outside, and they'll be perfectly fine. So I wouldn't leave them outside quite yet, because it's still, we're getting some frost. When I came in this morning, our little pond was frozen over, so it's still pretty cold. So I would give them some protection if you're going to start them outside, but definitely full light. Probably the most common issue I see with people who start seeds indoors in their house is really leggy plants that are very long and thin. And that's almost always a result of lack of sunlight, which is a challenge, right? So a lot of houses don't necessarily have access to full light, but as much as possible, find a south-facing window or some other area where you're going to get a lot of light streaming in. Put them right by that window, and they should be quite healthy there if they have access to at least 6 hours of light a day. So a few important considerations there. Now, you could also invest in artificial lights if you want to, and those will certainly help. People who are starting a lot of seeds indoors often do that, but that's an additional step, and I don't necessarily recommend that right away, not until you kind of get into the rhythm of seed starting. So let's talk about seed for a moment, because of course you do need seed in order to start.
Dan, one quick
Yeah,
question. How
yeah,
much, if you're gonna start these inside, how much space are you gonna need to kind of dedicate to them?
that's a great question. Well, I mean, that really depends on the size of your garden. I would say that even a small space can yield a lot of seedlings. So for example, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but this is a wildflower here called blazing star, or liatris. And in this little tiny area here, this is maybe 5 inches by 10 inches or so. There's easily over 100 plants in there, which I could then bring right outside once it warms up in a few weeks. So you could potentially get a lot of plants in a very small area, but some plants are going to require more space. For example, tomatoes. Tomatoes are usually grown out to be quite large before they're transplanted outdoors. Usually they're given, 1 to 2 months at least indoors, and they grow quite fast if it's warm. They will get, almost 2 feet tall oftentimes before you plant them outside. So for those, you probably want more space. In a 1 foot by 1 foot area, you'll be able to fit maybe 10, 12 plants at most, but not much more than that. So it really does depend to some extent on what kind of plant you're starting, and also how many plants you need. But even in a small area, you can really do a lot of good by starting plants indoors, especially if you're going to be growing plants that don't necessarily need to grow massive before you grow out them. So for example, I'm going to be starting some basil in a few moments. And basil, we transplant them when they're only maybe 3 inches tall. So we can get a lot of plants in a very small area before we bring them outside. That's a great question.
I have another question that's related. Is there a certain height that determines when it's time to bring your seedlings outdoors to strengthen? This person has little tomatoes that they've grown indoors, but not sure when to get them outdoors.
Right. Great question. Yeah. So that really depends on the kind of plant we're talking about. So the most important thing to know about your plants are they frost sensitive or are they hardy? If they are frost sensitive, like tomatoes, like peppers, like eggplant, like okra, like tomatillos, like basil, so many plants that we really appreciate during the height of the growing season. These are really summer loving plants. If you put them outside and it even dips close to 32 degrees, they will most likely die in a single night. So really important that we wait until danger of frost has passed before we bring those outside. So generally in this area, in Amherst, that would be roughly the middle of May. Maybe after the first week of May, you should be safe around then. So at this point, all of our heat-loving plants that are frost sensitive are inside in a protected area. We're not going to move them out until that danger of frost has passed. You could start to harden them up a little bit before that period by bringing them out during the day on warm days and then bringing them back inside at night so that they're not in danger of frost. And that will harden them up, meaning that they will start to get hardier because they're in the elements, right? They're in the wind, they're under direct light. But again, I wouldn't even start that process until early May because there's no reason to harden them up before they're going to be going to the ground within a week or two. So there's no reason to bring them out right now. If your plants have reached a point where they need to be potted up, which we're going to talk about in a minute, then you just need to give them more room, more soil, and keep them indoors for a while. Now, smaller plants that are frost hardy, such as everything in the brassica family, these are the mustard plants, these are your broccoli, your cauliflower, your cabbage, your arugula, spinach. All of those plants could definitely be put outside as long as it's going to be above 10 degrees, they will survive. So you can bring them outside right now if you wanted to, perfectly safe. I would give them some protection for the first few days because if you're moving them from one extreme environment, which is your indoor space, extremely protected, to the outdoor environment where they're going to be under the elements, you want to keep in mind that they're going to need some time to transition. So put them outside on a day or two when it's going to be warmer. So today would be a good day to bring them out. But if it's going to be getting, if we're going to have a really strong rain coming up or a thunderstorm, I would probably bring them inside for that period of time, just so that they don't all vanquish in the matter of a few hours if you have really strong rain or winds. So great questions. And if anyone has specific questions about plants that they want to start, please ask because again, all plants have somewhat different requirements. So if you want to know whether your plants are frost hardy or they're sensitive, let me know and I'll tell you also when to start them. I am going to, by the way, conclude with talking about what plants can be started in the next month or so. So that's really important to know because every plant has a different window. And that's the ideal time to be starting. And by the way, I should mention to back up for just a second, not all plants that you're going to be putting in your garden need to be started indoors. A lot of plants can be what's called direct seeded, meaning that you can put the seed right in the ground and they will germinate and they'll be very happy. Now, other plants you definitely need to start indoors. There's also a lot of plants that you could start right in the ground by direct seeding, or you could start indoors and then transplant. So there's both extremes. Some examples of transplant-only plants would be, again, all of the nightshades, so the tomatoes, eggplant, peppers. In general, I start parsley indoors because it has a long period of germination. In general, I start onions and leeks indoors, although some people do direct seed them. But again, they take a long time to germinate and to grow out. So I almost always want to start those plants indoors. On the other extreme, the direct seeded plants, I always direct seed carrots. I never start carrots indoors. I always direct seed peas, although I have heard of some people starting peas indoors. I always direct seed my beans. I always direct seed spinach, although some people do start spinach indoors. The advantage of direct seeding is you don't have to take care of seedlings indoors, right? You could just put them right in the ground and that's it. Then after that, you don't have to touch them again. With transplant, the advantage is that you get a head start. You get to start them much earlier. They'll grow much faster at those early stages versus if you just try to put them outside. If you try to put a tomato seed outside, it wouldn't even germinate until late June. So you would most likely end up with very few, if any, fruit that season because they just wouldn't have enough time that summer to really produce a viable plant. So for those, you absolutely need to start them indoors.
Dan, is there
So,
anything that you need to do to prepare the seeds before you plant them, either for indoors or for outdoors?
great question. So that's what's often referred to as seed conditioning, things that we do to seed before they're planted, either indoor or outdoor. Now, there definitely are seeds that require some conditioning. Examples would be seeds that require what's called scarification, which is just a fancy word for rubbing a seed against sandpaper. So a lot of seeds, for example, that evolved in an environment where they would have had fire, for example, certain pine trees, even lupin, which I started over here, often needs scarification, which is basically when you rub a seed against sandpaper or you nick it with a file. So that's one example of conditioning. Most vegetable and fruit seeds don't require that. Some seeds require what's called stratification, which basically mimics going through a winter. So, for example, if you're growing nut trees, those would involve stratification, where you basically put them into a cold, moist environment for several months, or even bury them in the ground over the winter, and only then would they germinate in the spring. So without that, they just would not germinate. Some seeds are soaked for a full day prior to being seeded. So an example of that, if you're growing sweet peas, which is a flower, not edible peas, those are often soaked for 24 hours, which makes them much more likely to germinate. So those are some examples, but the vast majority of seeds that you're going to be starting are not going to require any kind of special conditioning. What they do require, though, is that your seeds are kept in the proper conditions. We almost always keep our seed in either the refrigerator or in a cool, dark environment. If they're kept under light or if they're kept in heat, your seeds will not last very long. Their viability will diminish tremendously. So when you order your seeds, if you can, try to keep them at least in a dark environment and ideally in a cool environment. The refrigerator, even the freezer work fine. Even just a cool area of your house can work fine as well. And ideally keep them away from moisture. Yeah. So those are, my recommendations. That's the most important thing to getting really good successes, starting with good quality seed. Great questions, by the way. Please keep them coming. Ask away.
All right,
So,
how about, we do have a couple more questions.
yeah.
One is about zucchini and summer squash specifically. Can these be started outside instead of inside?
Great question. Yeah, so zucchini and summer squash, and in fact, all of the winter squash as well, they all fall into that in-between category where they could be started right in the grounds, or they could be started indoors if you want to give them a head start. Now let's talk about, that's a great example because both those, I would say it's kind of 50-50. A lot of particularly commercial farmers will start zucchini and summer squash from seed right in the ground, direct seeding it, in part because it's going to save them a lot of time. But if you do that, you need to wait until the soil is warm. And that for us is going to be usually early June or so. So those seeds will take about 1 week or so before they even germinate. And then, you're going to have a seedling that's maybe about 3 inches tall by the end of June at the earliest. That means that your zucchini will be ready, let's say late July or so, versus if you start it indoors, you're going to have zucchini and summer squash that's going to be ready a good 3 weeks earlier because you started it indoors and then you moved it outside. And zucchini and summer squash are extremely easy to start indoors. So that's a great example of one that I always start indoors because I want to have a head start on the season. I want to get that zucchini and summer squash as early as possible. The other advantage is that oftentimes if you direct seed zucchini and summer squash, well, first of all, you're reliant on rain or irrigation. If those seeds go without rain for a full week, those seeds are just going to wither and die. They're not going to germinate. So you're really dependent on moist soils. You're also a little bit at the whim of wildlife. A lot of birds, a lot of animals, critters will dig up those seeds and try to eat them if you direct seed them. if you're having problems with that, I highly recommend transplanting, because then you're starting with a plant. So they're not going to have access to those seeds. And the plants are much less interesting to them as food than those seeds are. So for that reason, I pretty much completely moved away from direct seeding zucchini, summer squash, or any of the winter squash. So those are some considerations to keep in mind. But again, if you don't want to mess with seed starting, if you want to just get your seeds in the ground, go for it. Just keep in mind some of those considerations.
So here's another question. How long will seeds last in storage under ideal conditions?
That is a great question. So, well, ideal conditions, most of us don't have ideal conditions, right? There are some ideal conditions out there. For example, there's a seed vault up in the Arctic Circle. I believe it's in Finland somewhere, where it's underground, and it's kind of in case of a nuclear apocalypse or something like that, where they have varieties of just about every seed on Earth. And in those conditions, sub-zero temperatures, those seeds will last for decades, if not hundreds of years. Under more or less normal conditions that we're going to be keeping them, let's say a refrigerator, it really does depend on the kind of seed, but I would say 3 to 5 years is an average lifespan for most vegetable seeds that we're going to be starting. But if you're in doubt, you can easily look it up just by checking out. If you Google seed viability chart, you'll find some great resources, and it'll tell you how many years most of these seeds are good for, because some seed is really at its best only within a single season. It needs to be fairly fresh. Some seed can last for 5 years without any problem. So it's good to know. If you're ever in doubt, it's actually quite easy to check if your seed is still good. So for example, here, I've got some basil seed that's now 2 years old, which we saved in our garden. This is a purple basil variety. It's beautiful, beautiful plant. If I wanted to check, I could just take some tissue or kitchen towel, wet it, and put my seeds in there and keep it in that tissue or kitchen towel nice and moist for a couple days. And within maybe 3 to 5 days or so, you should be able to see the seed germinating and actually starting to grow if it's kept in that moist environment. So if you're having trouble seeing any seed germinate, most likely those seeds are not viable anymore, and you might want to consider getting fresh seed. If most of them are germinating, you're good to go. So that's one way you can check. I would also just mention that this year, sorry, there's a truck going by right now. Second. This year, a lot of seed companies are not able to fulfill orders, at least right now. They're overwhelmed because so many people are trying to, start gardens or ordering seed. So they've, seen record numbers of orders. So, for example, Johnny's isn't even sending seeds to home gardeners for the next, I think, until the end of April or so. So it's a bit of a challenging time to order seed. Now, I should mention that there are still a lot of garden centers that are open even through this pandemic. So if you're in the area, you might want to check out Hadley Garden Center. Certainly, a lot of the bigger stores like Home Depot and Lowe's carry seed as well. And a lot of them even carry nice heirloom varieties these days. So if you're in doubt, if you have really old seed, you're going to be wasting a lot of your time and energy, and you're going to be frustrated if you have bad results. So you might want to get some fresh seed. They're not expensive. A seed packet usually goes for $1, $2, maybe $3 at most. And again, you're going to be getting hundreds of seeds usually in each seed packet. So get yourself some good seed, and you'll have much better results.
Okay, couple more questions.
Yeah.
One, is the seed library at UMass open?
Great question. So there is, in fact, a seed library that just opened last year. It's really exciting. That has free seeds and some amazing, beautiful varieties in that. They have been actually sending out seeds to individuals. There's a Google form that you can fill out. I haven't seen it in the last week or two. I haven't checked to see if it's still up because it's just one librarian who's actually been just out of the goodness of her heart keeping that going for people. So check it out. If you Google UMass Seed Library, I think it's called UMass Aggie Seed Library. Check it out. Their website should be updated, hopefully. And if it is still updated, try that Google form. You can request seeds, and they'll send them right to you, which is an incredible service that we have access to here as part of our community. So check it out. Your local library might also have a seed library. They've been popping up here and there all across the country. So check them out if you're interested. Great ideas. Of course, you can also ask your friends if they have seed. A lot of people have extra seeds that they're happy to share. Great question.
And
Any other questions?
how do we know when the last frost date will actually be given this New England moody weather?
I know, you're right. Yeah, New England weather is pretty crazy. Even yesterday, I saw some snowflakes coming down. Obviously we had 3 inches in our area. I think fall was that last week, while the cherry trees were in bloom. So yeah, we have some really freaky weather around here. But the last frost date generally is what's called the historical frost. So usually it's a conservative date, meaning that there is almost never a frost after that date. That's why mid-May is considered to be the frost date in our climate, which we are here in zone 5B, which tells you the hardiness zone. If you're up in the hill towns, your frost date might be even later than that. And by the way, you can easily look that up. There are frost date calculators out there. You just enter your zip code. It will tell you your frost date. So mid-May is very conservative. We've almost never, with a few exceptions, had frosts after that date. If you want to really push it, early May usually is safe. But again, in our climate here, anything can happen. So I generally am, I would rather wait longer, because it would be really a shame to plant all of our tomatoes or peppers or okra out early and see them all lost in a single day. So really not worth it. You're not going to gain a lot by getting them in the ground, a week early, especially with something like this. So I would say, be conservative. Wait till your last frost date to plant out any frost-sensitive plants. I think for the hill towns, May 21st, so third week of May, is usually what most people go by. So that's what I would use. If you happen to be in a warmer climate, so if you're even down in Holyoke, you might even be able to get them into the ground a week before Amherst. So check out a frost date calculator if you're not sure.
Great. And are there any flowers that you recommend planting in our area?
So many, yeah. So, the sky is the limit when it comes to flowers. If you look at a seed catalog from a local company like Johnny's or Fedco or High Mowing Seed, those are just 3, all from northern New England. They almost only have seed that is hardy in our climate. Now that means that they're either perennial, that they will come back year after year, or they are annual plants that grow extremely quickly in a single season. Those would be plants like zinnia or cosmos or marigold that you can start from seed right now, and by mid to late summer through fall, you'll have beautiful large flowering plants that will go right up until the last frost. So yes, we start with a lot of seeds. I can go through some specifics if anyone's interested. And so actually, we're going to talk about one flower that we love here, which is this garden lupin. But I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. We'll talk some more about flowers in a bit. I want to show you guys how we start seed here. So first of all, just real quick, let's take a look at a seed packet together, because there's a lot of really good info on seed packets. This is a Toma Verde Tomatillo from High Mowing, which is a wonderful seed company based in the Hudson Valley of New York. And they almost exclusively sell what's called open pollinated seed, which means seed that you can save seed from, and you'll get very good quality results. They're not hybrid seeds, they're open pollinated. Also oftentimes referred to as heirloom seeds. So on the seed packet, first of all, it will generally tell you how many days to maturity. That means from the time that you put that plant outside to the time that you're able to harvest it, how many days roughly go by. In this case, 60 days to maturity. So this tomatillo, which I'm going to be starting today, is going to grow in a protected space for about a month, maybe 5, 6 weeks at most. Then we're going to put it outside after the danger of frost. And at that point, it's going to take another 60 days before we have our tomatillos in full maturity. So let's say that's going to be roughly mid-August is when they're really going to get going into gear. And they're going to produce all the way up to our first frost, which usually is mid to late October around here. So they're going to have a solid 3 months of production. Really important to know that. On the back, you'll also usually see the seed depth planting. Now, it's really important to know how deep to plant your seed. And a good rule of thumb is that the smaller the seed, the closer to the surface it should be. My general rule of thumb is that you want to plant a seed 3 times as deep as the diameter of that seed. So a tiny little seed like tomatillos don't need to go deep at all. The recommendation here is a 1/4 inch. I could even put them an 1/8 of an inch and that would be just fine. Something that's going to have a larger seed like corn, beans, peas, okra, those are going to have to go a little bit deeper into the ground. And lastly, it's going to tell you days to germination, which is important to know. The days to germination for tomatillo is 7 to 14 days. That's the time between planting and the time that you'll see a seedling come out of the soil. And that's important to know because you need to know roughly when to expect it. Some plants germinate extremely quickly, like corn, for example, will germinate in 3 days oftentimes. And if it's 2 weeks and corn hasn't germinated, I know that those seeds or something went wrong, right? Either it wasn't warm enough or I forgot to water or the seeds were no good. Versus if 2 weeks go by with tomatillos and some of them are just starting to emerge, that's perfectly normal. That's, in keeping with their characteristics. So important to keep those in mind. And again, you can find that all on a seed packet. And of course, you can also look it up online. So why don't we actually start some seed together? I'm going to be starting, let's see, we're going to start some purple basil, and we might even start some Malabar spinach together too, which is it's actually not related to spinach at all. It's a tropical spinach-like vining plant. It's a climbing plant where the greens are edible, just like spinach. They taste very similar, but it's actually a heat-loving plant that will grow 10 feet tall if you give it vertical space to climb on. So I'm going to actually start our purple basil in an open flat. So I'm going to grab one of these. It's used. I'm just going to dump that out. I'm going to put some soil in there. Now, really important, I should have mentioned this earlier, whatever container you end up using, whether it's a plastic container, paper, whatever it might be, it needs to have the ability to drain on the bottom. So you can see there's holes there, really important. Whatever it is, it's got to be draining. So if it didn't have those holes, it would just be sitting in water and those plants would rot eventually. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up almost to the top, okay? And my second step, I'm just going to firm this soil down a little bit. Now, I could just use my hands to do that, or what I often do is just use something that's about the same size or a piece of wood and just kind of push it down a little bit, and that will kind of create really nice firm soil. Now, at this point, some people will very carefully sprinkle their seeds into rows, and that's great because then it'll germinate really evenly. But you know what? If I want to be a little bit quicker, I'm just going to take my seed and actually just sprinkle it all over. Now, I don't want to add too much seed. If you overseed, you're going to end up with something that looks like this. I don't know if you all can see this. These guys here, this is a native wildflower that I was trying to grow out. It's a Lobelia cardinalis, which is a cardinal flower. Beautiful, beautiful flowers. But I added way too much seed, and you can see just how thick they are. I can't possibly transplant these outside. So unfortunately, these are probably just I'm probably going to compost these. Just way too much seed. So in general, less seed is better, especially with something that's going to be really small seeded. Basil has very small seeds. So I'm just gonna go ahead and very gently sprinkle some seeds down, just kind of interspersing them. You can see I'm not being very precise here at all, but I wanna get a sense, I'm looking for maybe a couple seeds per square inch. Not all of them are gonna germinate, so I wanna have some insurance. That looks, let's see, that looks pretty good, maybe a little bit more. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and cover my seed. And you could do that with sand, but I usually just use more potting soil on top. So I'm just gonna go ahead, and now basil is quite small, so I don't need to bury it very deep. I'm gonna go for about a 1/4 inch depth. And I'm just going to just take a little bit of potting mix and just kind of rub it on top, try to be fairly even about it. And the reason you need to cover it is because this will help keep the seeds evenly moist as they are germinating, which is really important. Okay, that looks pretty good. And the second to last step, I'm gonna firm it down once more. The reason I'm firming it down twice is because I really wanna make sure that there's good seed to soil contact. If there's a lot of air pockets, your seed actually won't germinate very well. So you want it to be fairly well pressed down. I'm not, putting all my weight on there, but certainly firming it down really nice. And lastly, got a label, right? So if you don't label your seed, I guarantee you're gonna forget what's in there or when you started it. And it happens to me all the time. So at this point, I always label all my seed. I usually write the variety. I'm gonna write purple basil. And I'm gonna write the date as well. Today being the April 23rd, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Great. And now I'm just gonna go ahead and stick that in there. And once I get this to wherever it's going to be, I'm gonna water it. So I'll water it right now. You wanna water it till it's really well moistened. I usually try to use something where it's gonna have a gentle water. This is not the best watering can, by the way. Try to use something that is not gonna displace too much soil. A little bit, not the neatest watering job, but that's okay. And that's pretty well saturated. At this point, actually, this tray doesn't necessarily need light until those plants come out of the ground. So for the next week, that's about how long basil usually takes to germinate. I could keep these anywhere as long as it's warm, because basil likes heat, and as long as I'm able to water it, right? So you can see a lot of water went through, so it needs to have something, at least a towel around it, anything that you can water neatly. But these are ready to go, and I'm just gonna water them once a day so that they don't dry out. Really, really important that your seeds do not dry out. So water them once a day and more if it seems like it's getting really dry. But otherwise, this is ready to go. Now, after these basil plants grow out, I'm gonna have to pot them up, which is basically a process of taking a seed, a seedling, and giving it more space. Now, that wouldn't be necessary if I used these cells, and that's the advantage of using celled containers. I could just put 1 or 2 seeds in each cell, and that way I wouldn't have to do anything. I could just let them grow out. But I actually chose to do this because it's easier for me to just sprinkle a bunch of seeds down, and that way I'll see how I'll have a sense of how many plants I have, and at that point I'm gonna pot them up. I'm gonna show you that process right now. So I have a few different plants I can pot up. I've got this lupin, which again is a perennial wildflower that is a nitrogen fixer. It's a legume. It's in the pea and bean family, and it produces gorgeous blue and purple flower heads in mid-May. These guys are ready to be potted up, so I'm going to go ahead and use, I think I'm going to use these cow pots. So I'm going to, looks like a lot of, okay. I'm going to go ahead and fill these guys up with some soil. Again, nicely moistened already. There's 1, 2. I'll do maybe 3 of these. And at this point, my goal is to try to get these seedlings out of here and put them in there without damaging the root system too much. Now, I know that these are ready to be potted up primarily because they've developed their first set of true leaves. Now, this is important. When seeds come up, almost all seeds will first develop what are called cotyledons, which are these tiny little first seeds, first leaves. And only after that will they produce their first true leaf, which looks quite different. If you can see right there, those are just cotyledons. That's a plant that's just germinating. It hasn't developed true leaves. That right there, those leaves that have those 5 petals, those are true leaves. That's how I know it's ready to be potted up. So I usually use something that's, long, kind of like one of these markers, these wooden markers. I pulled it out. You can see here, I'm going to show you the root system. It's quite well developed at this point. So it's got a really nice root system right there. And at this point, what I want to do is just kind of make a divot in one of these pots. I'm going to put the root system right in there and then just gently firm everything down. Again, really good soil to root contact, essential. And there you go. That's a potted up plant that can now continue growing in this pot for probably the next month. And at that point, I could put it right in the ground. But these plants are actually, I could put them in the ground even in a few weeks. Of course, I'm going to label it as well, and I'm going to water it. And that's what's going to make sure that we have a ready to go plant. So lupin, date. Okay. And this plant is actually quite hardy, so I could even leave it outside in a protected area as long as it has full light, or I could put it inside. Totally for me. So I'm going to do that twice more. 2 more plants. And the beautiful thing about these open cells, like what I did with the basil, I get to choose the best plants. I'm not going to choose the ones that are kind of looking weak or that are taking a long time to germinate. I have my choice of the best ones. So here's another really nice one. Again, I'm making sure that all of the root is under the soil level. If any root is exposed, you have a danger of it drying out. Okay, looks good. And we'll do one more. Okay. Down a little bit. Beautiful. Okay. Those guys are ready to go once they have some water. So really simple. You can see here I could do the same thing. I've got some thyme that I started from seed. This thyme was started on March 9th, and I could do the same thing if I wanted to with these. You can see they have really well-developed root systems already. In fact, quite large. That is all one root system right there. So I could have even potted these up earlier, but it doesn't really matter. They have plenty of space here that they could grow out. So I'm going to pot those up a little bit later. So that's pretty much the process. I'm going to show you guys how I start things in cells, and I'm going to do that with Malabar spinach. So again, which is a tropical variety, not related to actual spinach that we know of, but similar flavor. So I'm going to go ahead and fill a couple of these 4 packs up. And I'm filling them right to the top, brushing off any extra soil. And now at this point, I'm going to make some small indents with my hands. These are pretty large seeds, so I'm going to go down about to my first knuckle. That's about a 1/2 inch, maybe. No, it's probably a full inch right there. So just like that. And now I'm going to take my seed out. And now I generally, whenever I'm potting things up, whenever I'm seeding into cells, I put 2 seeds, sometimes even 3 seeds in each cell. Now, the reason I do that is because if one seed doesn't germinate, which happens, I want to have a backup. It's basically an insurance policy. I want each of these cells to have a plant in it. So I'm going to put 2 seeds in each of those cells, just like that. So there's 2. There you go. 2 and 2. Now at this point, I need to cover these back up. So I'm just going to take a little handful of potting mix and just kind of rub it on top there. Add it down a little bit. Okay. And with some water and a label, those will be ready to go. So that's my process for, I do a lot of things in cells, especially plants that are really, really good germinators, and not usually plants that have larger seed. So I actually start all my corn indoors with this method. I start my zucchini and winter squash with this method. Cucumbers, I start right in cells. And for those kinds of plants, actually, cucumber and winter squash, I like big cells because they are going to get beefy really, really quickly. So that's kind of the process there. You have options, open container, cells. Just kind of know what you want to do and why, and experiment, right? So any of these methods would work for any of these plants. So it's really up to you how you want to go about it. I really recommend trying out a few strategies and seeing what you personally like more, what makes sense for your lifestyle, for your garden, whatever you might want to be doing. So I want to
So
talk about.
we're just about out of time, Dan.
Yeah. So I just have one last thing that I want to mention, which is what can you be seeding right now in the next few weeks? So right now is a great time to be starting a lot of brassica plants. Again, these are the kale, collard, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. Go ahead and start those right now. You can even start those outside in cells. They don't need a lot of heat to germinate. So that's a great time to start those. This is really the last chance you have to start eggplant, pepper, or tomatoes. So if you want to start those, get those going right away. And if you can, give them some additional heat. They will respond very quickly to heat. In the next 2 weeks or so, we're going to be starting a lot of our cucurbit plants. These are our cucumbers, our winter squash, and our summer squash and zucchinis. So if you're interested in starting those, they're really fast right out of the gate. When you see them, they'll come up within a week, and they'll be ready to go outside within 3 weeks usually. So I usually I'm aiming to get those plants in the ground at the end of May, or even better yet, early June. So I'm going to be starting those in 1 or maybe even 2 weeks. So get those ready to go if you want to get them in. And lastly, we're going to be, of course, starting our basil, right? We just started some right now. So if you want to get some basil going for the summer, now is a great time to be starting that. Thank you guys so much, and happy to answer any questions.